Hey everyone, and welcome to the GRC Room 5 Questions. I'm Mike Andrews, here once again with Karina Klever of Klever Compliance, and we're happy to welcome guest Caleb Mattingly, who's the founder of Secure Cloud Innovations, a company that helps startups with their cybersecurity and compliance. How you doing, Caleb?
Doing good, Mike. Thank you guys so much for having me on the show.
Glad you're with us. So without further ado, let me pass it over to Karina for a brief introduction, then we'll get right into the 5 questions.
Yep, and I am Karina of Klever Compliance. We are a compliance management as a service provider, and our biggest charter of the day is avoiding tool lard. So Caleb, I'm going to go ahead and ask you the first question. So what part of cyber GRC do businesses struggle with the most?
That's a great question. When we're working with companies, I think probably the biggest stumbling block is getting the policies right. I think one of the biggest things that people end up having a lot of questions over is what is actually required to be compliant with SOC 2 or ISO or GDPR or HIPAA versus what is something that's just best practice that we see in policies in general, right? So I think identifying those and then seeing how they scope back to the compliance framework is something that ends up being a pretty big question mark. And then the cadence that we're doing the activities, right, for the actual compliance framework. So whether that's like access control reviews or user access log reviews or tabletop exercises, how often are we required to actually do this versus how often should we do this? So
yeah, that's so important. You see some companies that really only focus on the documentation, the policy, the process, documentation for compliance purposes, and it's just not that useful. Like, you can make that really useful to where employees and contractors benefit from it, and other companies may want to copy it. And rather than just having it as a pile of papers, or some files that you just keep in the drawer and no one ever looks at.
So one thing I'm going to add to that is published documentation, policy, process, procedure, standard, template, yes, whatever you call it, right, is supposed to have controls inside of it. And those controls are the ones that you need to attest to. I am seeing GRC tool after GRC tool after GRC tool that have completely decoupled the documentation stack from the controls. They've made their lives so much more complicated than it needs to be, and it's mind-boggling to me because it defies all basic GRC principles. So that's just one thing for me to add to that. All right, Mike, go for it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Next question for Caleb. What's one data breach that stands out to you, and why that one?
It's hard to pick a single data breach, Mike, and there's been so many lately. But I think a lot of the healthcare data breaches is the first thing that comes to mind. We work with a lot of healthcare organizations. In particular, we worked with a neurologist a couple years ago that, every time you go to see a doctor or a specialist and stuff, you kind of just assume like, hey, these guys are definitely HIPAA compliant, right? They've been in business for years. They're definitely doing things right. Well, we walked into this company and ended up finding that everyone was using their personal Hotmail accounts, like their live, .live or live.com accounts and MSN.com accounts and stuff. And we were like, is this something you guys recently changed? Because this is kind of crazy. And they were like, no, it's been like this forever. Like, this is just how we do it. And the fact that all of them were tied to personal accounts was kind of crazy. And I think we're seeing more and more within a lot of these traditional, especially brick and mortar companies that aren't, typically trying to keep up with the latest trends in technology. They're just trying to get by, right? They just want to make sure that everything is working. And aren't necessarily as concerned about security, and that ends up being a big issue, right? And that's why we end up seeing these huge data breaches that occur, especially within the healthcare organization. Their mission is not to be the most secure organization. Their mission is to save lives, right? To go and help people's health and to save lives. And I think over the next 10 or so years, we're going to see a lot of growth within the healthcare industry, especially around compliance and security as AI tools are coming in that they can start. Yeah, fingers crossed. Exactly, Karina. But yeah, we're hoping to see a lot more growth there as a lot of these like new security tools are coming out that make it so that you don't have to have a full-on security, like a ton of security people that are managing it, and you can have your security manager and maybe an ops person that are able to handle it on an ongoing basis.
So one thing I'd like to recommend is for anybody that's going to go see a healthcare provider or have an insurance company or an HMO or anything healthcare related, go on HHS OCR's breach report and make sure that that facility is not listed on this report, because what that report means is they've had a breach that within the last, that's actually open and being investigated. Usually it's in the last 2.5 or so years. When the breach report is done being investigated, it drops off the list. But it's good for you to make a decision about, do I give them my social security number when I go in there? Like, do they really need it? Right? They might be using their Hotmail account. So just a little bit of a food for thought. Mike, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. When you go to a medical provider and they want to just use their fax machine a lot, you pretty much just did a risk assessment and it didn't go well, you know, because there's way better solutions. And if they're doing that, it's because they think, oh, well, we can do whatever we want with the fax machine. And if we use our computer systems, you know, we have to think a lot more about HIPAA. So that's something to keep in mind too. But yeah, I mean, if you think of any industry that you'd want to see security and compliance happening, it's that one. Does HIPAA do a good enough job of that? Probably not prescriptive enough, but it does pay to look out for these things on our own.
All right. So next question. What is the most impactful GRC related advice that you ever received?
That's a good question. You know, I think the best advice I ever got was from an auditor, and they specifically told us, don't ever tell our customers that you're secure once you're compliant, because compliance doesn't equal security. And that was something that I thought was pretty kind of jaw-dropping at the time, but in retrospect, there's a lot of SOC 2 compliant companies that get hacked every day, right? And ISO and GDPR, HIPAA, all of those, where they are compliant, you know, they're 100% compliant, and that they're still being taken advantage of or pwned or whatever, you know, whatever tool you want to, or whatever way you want to phrase that. And I think that mentality was good because compliance can be a really great first step towards security, but it's not the last or the end all be all step of your security journey as a company. So
yeah, that is a good one, and that kind of crosses over to the legal realm. Should you say that? Because what liability is it bringing on? And we can't say that definitively. So you'll see a lot of companies on their website say, we implement industry best practices, but there's always a chance of this happening. And does that absolve them of all risk? Probably not, but you know, every court legal proceeding is different, and that's just what you see a lot of companies doing. That is an important one. Karina, you have anything on that?
Yeah, so you know, we're all following checkbox compliance. We're on a tool, we're following kind of the spreadsheets that we all know what they say. The hackers know what they say too, right? And when we go and we implement these, you know, minimum viable product compliance engagements, the holes are so clear. It doesn't matter whether or not you have a logo on your page that says we're ISO, we're whatever compliant, right? The reality is we're not taking these governance programs and making them appropriate for our actual operations and our functional true way that things work in our companies. And so we're leaving big wide holes, and it's very unfortunate.
Yeah, the legal consideration that Mike just brought up was really interesting too, because I'm not exactly sure where you'd be able to say like we are secure, you know, at that point. I think, and as we all know, like security is kind of a new word for trust nowadays, right? Like if you say we're secure, it means we're trustworthy. And the reality is that if there's legal ramifications to saying that, I would be curious to see who eventually would set the precedent for, or I guess what the boundary would be for, hey, you're allowed to say we are secure, we are trustworthy, we are like able to do business with you, and you can trust that you can give us your data, which I think is what originally SOC 2 and ISO 27001 were supposed to be oriented towards, right? Like setting some kind of threshold of trust or of like a security standard. But it's a really good question.
Yeah, good information, Caleb. The fourth one. So what do you and your company do differently that allows you to excel in this field?
Yeah, that's a good question. So our background is primarily like cloud security engineering. So it's less about the traditional GRC kind of approach of being more oriented towards like policy and governance and such, and more so around like actually doing hands-on changes within a cloud environment for you know, jobs that we had previously now for customers that we have. And so our real way of differentiating lately and actually being able to do this more quickly has been to utilize a lot more cloud tooling and cloud like programming to actually implement things quicker. We have several Terraform scripts that we've written in order to actually like put a lot of the compliance requirements in place in a cloud environment very quickly. That traditionally would have taken 20 or 30 hours for somebody to do. Like we can do that in essentially 30 minutes to an hour for a customer, which has been awesome. But yeah, leveraging a lot of the cloud engineering experience alongside of the cybersecurity knowledge and expertise has been a big differentiator for us.
That's good. In your content on LinkedIn, you do a good job of, in a practical way, speaking directly to startups and showing that by working with you, you get the stuff done in a good amount of time, but it doesn't sound like you're looking to take shortcuts, and that allows them to focus on their mission, product, services, customer service, growth, and all of that. So that's awesome.
I appreciate it, Mike. Yeah, our approach is really supposed to be to help enable businesses. And I think if you take shortcuts, one, it comes back to hurt you as a business, right? Like people find out about that. It's not something where you take the shortcut, you make a quick buck, and then you move on. Businesses talk to each other. Like the startup ecosystem is a community, and people talk to each other about what vendors are good, what vendors are bad, and that you want to avoid and everything. And for us, we always try to take the approach of, if we were in the customer's shoes, what is the level of service and quality and expertise that we would want to be receiving in retrospect? And then how do we bring just a little bit more than what they'd be expecting, right? That's always our approach to it.
Yep, that's the magic. All right, so last question. What is the one top thing that a business can do today to strengthen its GRC posture?
The one top thing to strengthen the GRC posture. I think that beyond just going through a regular audit, it would be finding a company like you guys as companies, right? Like, or our company, or it doesn't really matter the specific company in general, but finding like a third party who, let's be honest, auditors want you to pass the audit, right? Like they want you to go through and pass in order to essentially come back the next year and continue using them and everything, right? And third party companies, like if you're not in an audit window, want you to be best prepared for passing the audit, right? So like we don't have that. I feel like there's sometimes a conflict of interest, in fact, of going to an auditor and asking them to give you any kind of feedback on like your compliance posture. So going to a third-party company that does manage compliance as a service, or embedded compliance, or whatever company wants to call it, being able to go to a company like that and say, hey, can you give us a gap assessment and let us know like exactly what's missing, and then additionally, can you tell us some better practice security engineering we can implement on top of the compliance stuff to really give us a better security posture? Because the more that you can have that, and the better you can speak to it with your enterprise level customers or even your startup customers, but especially enterprises, the more trust you get with them, the more likely it is that you're able to close the deal from a security perspective. And as I said before, we look at security as an enabler, right? Like in the sales process, we've seen our customer sales process go from 12 to 18 months, for a sales cycle, down to 6 months, 4 to 6 months, really, after getting SOC 2 or ISO in place. Like there's so much more trust that's involved when you've done that. And then additionally, if you can speak to other security practices that you have in place on top of just the GRC or compliance pieces to that. So yeah, that's been really cool to see. And I think it's definitely something I would suggest to any companies that are out there that are listening or, interested, like reach out to you, Karina, or Mike or myself, like happy to talk to people about that. But I think getting practical advice from experts is always helpful, especially if you want to like reduce your sales cycle and essentially close more deals. So
yeah, that's a great tip. You see a lot of startups, they'll have their engineering team just use a product like Vanta, Drotter, or one of them, and that's great. They may very well have the technical capacity, but if they're focusing on compliance, they're probably not focusing on the thing they're mainly supposed to do, right? It's like startups are already known you work a lot of hours and you're pursuing growth and all that. So sometimes when you're working with an external provider like any of our companies, It's not just for the expertise; it's also for the cost, for the time savings. Because if you're a high growth company, especially if you're VC backed, you got to do a lot. And this is a great. It's very efficient to work with a company like ours. So.
Totally agree. I mean, and your VCs, like any of your investors, they're not paying you to spend a bunch of time, 250 hours in a year on compliance. They're paying you to spend as much time as possible on your product, on your go-to-market, on building the company, on getting value so that you can eventually exit and they make their money back, right? That's what they care about. They want you to be secure. And I had somebody else previously ask me, do VCs care about security, right? Like, do they care? Can you go to them and start building partnerships and stuff? And it's a great thought. But at the end of the day, the VCs want the companies that they're investing in to be secure, but they don't care how they get secure, right?
Yeah.
They're not pushing that. They're just wanting it to happen, and they want the founders or whoever's in charge of managing that to manage it however they want to. But again, the main focus of any business, right, is not security unless you're a security business. But even then, it's really about how do you build a great product, bring it to market, and make sure that you build trust with your customers that's long lasting, right? And that's what compliance does.
And it actually not only gets you there, but it is able to manage and oversee operations long term if you have all of the triggers correctly in place and you're measuring it forever. It's not an arrival, right? I've never shown up to a center of excellence for GRC. I've always, you start somewhere and you just keep going in perpetuity because that's just part of your normal operations. It's never an arrival.
Right. Just like products, right? You're never done building your product, right? Till maybe when you sell it. But in that case, you're kind of done building your security journey too at that point. So
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you guys so much for having me. This is great.
Very informative.
Other than LinkedIn, Kayla, is there anywhere else you'd like the audience to find you?
If they want to reach out through our website, securecloudinnovations.net, that's it. We have the world's longest domain name, I think. We're in contention there, but yeah, feel free to reach out on our contact us form.